The views and opinions expressed by the guests of the Inspira Podcast do not necessarily represent the official policy or position of any agency of the United States government or any organization, public or private.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Welcome to the Inspira Podcast, hosted by your girl, me, Erika Mueller Chen. I'm an international development specialist with over a decade of experience leveraging the amazing power of sport to promote peace and positive social impact. My career has allowed me to live in Europe, Southern Africa, and Latin America. In 2022, I accepted an offer for my dream job in sports diplomacy. And I also became an employee family member to a U.S. diplomat, aka an EFM. This podcast is all about inspiration and career advice. Each episode, I'll interview an inspirational global changemaker working in sport for development, social impact, or the diplomatic service. This series is perfect if you have interest in breaking into one of these sectors, or you've already landed that dream role and are keen to learn from thought leaders. Enjoy today's episode and stay inspired.
What's next? Teams need to be taking up that mantle. Teams need to be calling out those kinds of actions, backing up their anti-racist statements and their land acknowledgement by actually standing up for Black and Brown and Indigenous athletes who are experiencing racism in a sport context. But I have hope that we are moving in that direction.
Welcome, friends. Today we are here with a special guest, Marika Warner. She is the Director of Research and Evaluation for Community Engagement and Social Impact Initiatives at Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment, the parent company of MLSE Launchpad, located in Toronto, Canada. Her portfolio includes program evaluation, academic research partnerships, and technology and innovation. Marika uses data to explore issues relating to sport for development, positive youth development, sport equity, and corporate social responsibility in professional sport. Marika is also an invited author of a chapter in the Routledge Handbook of Sport and Sustainable Development, and she's also authored papers and publications such as the Journal of Sport for Development, where her and I started emailing a few years ago about JSFD. Marika is also a retired professional dancer, a former physical therapist, and a mom. So welcome, Marika. You've done it all.
A few things. Thanks so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. And one thing I like to do before we jump into the questions is just share the reason why you inspire me, because I've named the podcast Inspira. And so in thinking about your background and your trajectory into the sport for development space, I know that you're really committed to bridging the gap between research and practice. And so I'm really inspired and impressed by that, because that is a recurring challenge in this sector. How do we bridge the gap, and how do we take what we learn from research and apply it into practice, and vice versa? And I also know that you're really committed to inclusion and anti-racist work in everything that you do. And so I'm really excited to learn more about how that looks in your work and why those things are important to you.
Sounds great. And I'm just happy to hear that you're inspired by that research to practice approach.
Maybe, Marika, to start us off, you can share more about your sports story in Canada.
My sports story. So I wouldn't say I grew up as an athletic kid. I was a dancer pretty much from the get-go. I did try out for my junior high basketball team, but I think I didn't even make it to the first game because I had too much ballet class going on after school and just couldn't keep up with both. So, I don't think I ever saw myself as an athlete. I was a dancer. Now, as an adult looking back, I see that as it's really a marriage of being an artist and an athlete at the same time. And I do consider dance a sport now, reflecting back in the way that we train youth, in the way that we create pedagogy, in the way that we, view professionalism, etc. But at the time, I wouldn't have identified as a sport kid. So, I was always loved and was surrounded by athletes. My brother was an athlete. Many of my friends were as well. But growing up, I'd say my main contact with sport was dance, although unconscious to me at the time. So then I became a physical therapist. So straight out of high school, I went to PT school, mainly inspired by my experiences as a young dancer with injuries and recovery. But then, through school, I was exposed to a lot of different avenues to work with the body. It ended up going in a different direction. Didn't work with dancers coming out of that at first. So I did continue to work in the dance space though. So as a professional dancer, as a dance instructor, as a choreographer, and then it was sort of a full circle moment after I had been practicing physical therapy for several years. I'd gone back to school to do my graduate studies, was then working sort of in a slightly different field, but still related to healthcare, where this job came up. A colleague forwarded it to me, and it just was a real full circle moment where I really saw that, yes, my dance background matters in this case. This is finally a job where I can bring my research expertise, my background as a physical therapist, my connections in the health and physical activity sector, and my dance background. And, the fact that I worked with kids in dance studios and know what that means to, develop physical literacy, develop life skills with young people through physical activity, that I could really bring all of that to this job. So I just made it my mission to get this job that I've now been doing, that I'm just going into my 7th season with MLSC. And I love my job. Just before we went to record, Erika said, let's try to keep it upbeat and positive, and no problem there. I love my job. I love my sector, so not an issue. So, that's sort of how I got to where I am today.
Oh, wonderful. And it must be really helpful for you to bring those different hats into your work. Like obviously you're doing M&E work, but being a former athlete and also having that physiotherapy and just understanding how the body moves and how to make it move in a healthy way and in a safe way. How has that kind of played a role in terms of how you approach sport for development or your role as a researcher?
Well, it's really interesting. I think, when we talk about safe sport, that's one area where my dance background really comes into play for me. Most people who end up working in the sport for development field are people who had some kind of positive experience with sport. Sport was good to us in some kind of way and led us to want to do more of it and work in that sector. So I think when we think back, even if we had experiences that were to some degree traumatic or were not exactly best practices in terms of positive youth development and life skills development, we think, well, it worked for me. It made me who I am today. So maybe it's a good thing. Maybe it's not all that bad. So it's been, that's been an interesting place for me to sort of challenge cognitively, to think about how dance education is done, how it was done when I was coming up, which, I'm 40 years old, so that was a while back now, how it's done today, and how I can translate those experiences and those learnings and reflections into how we offer sport for development programming for youth-facing barriers now. So that's one piece. And then coming from my physical therapy career, I think the biggest takeaway moving into sport for development was just this always thinking evaluatively. So even before I became a credentialed evaluator, before I went back to school and really learned how to do research, as a physical therapist, you're doing that baseline assessment. You're creating goals. Every week when you're seeing the patient, you're assessing how they're progressing towards the goals. So it's that you're using outcome measures, you're using standardized tools. So it's that a really rigorous approach to what did I say we were going to achieve? And how do I know that I've achieved it, that I bring to what I do now, and that I try to impart to those around me and to others in our sector as well.
Excellent. Yeah, I can certainly see those relationships being really helpful for you and the people around you to just kind of absorb how you're viewing things, and that rigor that you said is extremely important when we talk about evaluation. And now in thinking about sport for development, I'm wondering if you can share more about how you define sport for development, or maybe how you describe it to people who are less familiar with the sector.
Yeah, so I think of it as sport for positive social change. I think of it as sport working towards positive economic and social outcomes. And I tend to think in terms of plus sport activities and sport plus activities. If we take it a step further, where sport plus activities, where sport is the primary hook and context, where people are engaging in sport because they want to be playing sports, they want to be physically active, and then in addition to the sport experience, they're learning important life skills, or they're getting positive mental health benefits or employment benefits, social capital, etc. And then plus sport, where this is where people have other social needs or other social outcomes that are important to them, like mental wellness, employment, education, etc. And they're achieving those through sport. And I think both are extremely important and equally powerful and valuable. But it's basically sport for good, sport for positive social change.
Nice, nice. That was very clear, very concise. It can be hard for everybody in the sector because we can get so like emotional about it and think about our own experiences and think about how different NGOs can describe the social issues that they're prioritizing. And so it varies depending on who you talk to, depending on that cultural or even geographic context. So I really appreciate your response there.
Yeah, no, that's so true. And I think, I challenge people at times who are in the sports sector, but who wouldn't identify as sport for development researchers or practitioners to think about other forms of sport or other sport contexts as being sport for development as well. Like, why can't elite sport also have positive social and economic outcomes? Why can't, recreation have positive social and economic, etc., or professional sport for that matter? So I think I sort of advocate for cannot all sport be sport for development in a sense.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And I'm sure we can talk about intentionality, right? It comes down to what are the outcomes, what's the process, all of those factors. So I'm with you. If you want to create a sport for development world, I'm on your team there. Yeah. Tell us more about the work at the foundation. I know that the MLSE Foundation has invested over $45 million into Ontario communities since 2009 and is really using the power of sport as a unifying force. And so what kind of in your own terms or in your own experiences are the aims and missions of the foundation, and how does Launchpad play into that?
Yeah, so the great question. And it's a really exciting time for MLSE Foundation. We are at a sort of a period of strategic revitalization, I would say, and that happened, once about 9 years ago or so, when we conceived and created Launchpad, which is our own space that we own and operate, where we control our own sport for development programming, which I'm sure we'll talk more about later. But so that was a big shift. From funding other organizations to do the programming to having our own space where we could do it in our own way and research our own outcomes. But now it's a shift towards Launchpad continuing to be Launchpad and also grow outside of our sport for development facility to sort of exist as a movement. And that includes both scaling our programming outside of our facility and also scaling our approaches to measurement and evaluation, our curriculum, all of the tools that we use to achieve the outcomes that we achieve in our space. And then Foundation also invests through community grants, facility refurbishments, things like court builds, which used to be an even bigger slice of what we do, but are still an important part of what we do, but I think have shifted to now where we're really doing them in a more data-driven, data-informed way, where we're creating new facilities based on need that we have created evidence around. Our community programs are also growing and becoming more and more evidence-based, where what we're doing outside of the facility in other communities is starting to look more and more like what we do inside Launchpad, which is where we really feel we develop our best practices in sport for development and then codify them so that they can be transferred and scaled to reach a broader population. So yeah, that's Foundation. Foundation, of course, is a fundraising body as well. And that's been a big challenge over the last couple of years, but it's really starting to bounce back. There's been a lot of shifts as well in the, philanthropic space and how that's looked over the past couple of years. But we have certainly weathered the storm, and I'd say are stronger than pre-pandemic in a lot of ways. I think the focus on sport equity is definitely more pronounced than ever. That's become a real area of expertise for us as well, and a space where we're really starting to claim some leadership in terms of like, how do you do sport for development in an anti-racist way explicitly? Whereas before, I think that we were always doing anti-racist things in our practice, but we're not explicit about it or didn't prioritize talking about it and translating and mobilizing knowledge about that particularly. So that's, a really important piece of the work too.
Great. And thinking about sport equity and those anti-racist approaches, I know you just said it's important to put a name to it and then kind of claim that leadership space and the work that you've already been doing, and maybe you didn't even identify that it was that anti-racist work. And now that you and the organization has done that, I'm wondering what advice or resources or tactics you might encourage other sport for development people or organizations to aim to include.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm a data person, right? So my first advice is always going to be collect some data, get some race-based data, start asking about race. Start asking youth, what they need, what they want, and know their identity when you're asking them. I think this is really important. There are just so many organizations out there that are really scared to even dip a toe into the race-based data space. But I think it's just such a valuable thing to do. It's an easy thing to add to a registration form so that then when you're looking at outcomes, if you are an organization that looks at outcomes, or even if you're doing a really light sort of post-program evaluation around, did you have fun? Would you recommend it to a friend? Would you come back? And you're able to look at that with a race-based analysis, you're going to learn a lot more about how you're reaching different groups of youth or different, members of the population that you're targeting. So I think that's always my first step, is start collecting and utilizing some race-based data. Get some advice if you're really not sure how to ask those questions. There's lots of expertise out there on that. Email us at Launchpad. We'll help you out because we're, obviously huge proponents and just would like to see more uptake in the sector of, collection and utilization of that race-based data because it's just so valuable. If you're a funder, same thing. Who are you funding? Know who you're funding in terms of identity and demographics served, et cetera. And also what their outcomes are and how are those demographic factors affecting the outcomes or interacting with the outcomes. That's a really great starting point. And from there, taking those insights, interpreting that data, creating some learnings that you can then move forward to improve on the areas of your business that need to improve.
Marika, I've heard you refer to Launchpad as a living lab. What does that mean, and what are some of the advantages of working in a living lab?
Yeah, so this is a really big differentiator for MLSE Launchpad, I would say, compared to other sport for development or community sport organizations in the community. Is that we have a lot of resources. We're very blessed in that we have a parent company that's a very rich corporation that funds us generously through their corporate partners and more. And we're able to really resource experiments where we can pilot a new approach. We can try, a new program and hypothesize about what outcome we think that program is going to achieve. And we can test that hypothesis in a pretty rigorous way, and in a very rapid way as well, that in an academic setting, it might take 3 years to go through ethics, put in the proposal, get the right PhD student, get them through their comps so that they can then do their project. Whereas we can get that done in a matter of, 6 months, 2 quarters. So we're able to answer a lot of questions. We're able to try out a lot of things, and that's a huge gift. And I think, we were able to, because of that, because we're set up that way, we were able to learn a lot during the pandemic as well, in terms of like what worked in virtual programming. We were in virtual programming for almost 2 years. Most of our sector was. So it was important as quickly as we could to learn what worked, what didn't work, what should we be doing in the virtual space, what was not worth it. So that's, a good example. And moving forward, getting back to in-person, there's obviously so much more to learn. And we're really looking forward to starting some new experiments and learning some new things in the lab.
Were there any things that you learned from that experience you now feel better equipped to move back into the in-person sport for development programming space?
For sure. I would say, the more than a gym sort of approach is something that really came home for us during the pandemic, where it was like, yes, we've always provided wraparound services in our space. We've always provided nutrition programming, counseling, those sorts of things, because we know that those things are so important for youth who face barriers to positive development to be able to access and engage in sport. But it became an even bigger focus, where now, nutrition supports were not previously part of our theory of change. I did a big refresh of our theory of change. I facilitated that over the course of the pandemic. And I think the fact that we were in mid-pandemic at the time that we refreshed our theory of change made it much richer and deeper, and allowed us to integrate like more holistic supports that do support and enable sustained participation in sport for development. We were providing winter apparel, like things that we just hadn't done because it would seem to be off mission or not related to our mandate, etc. Where we really started to see that it actually was. And then that, that was part of how anti-racism and sport equity became that much more embedded at that time as well. Because, we were all here in 2020 and all experienced the awakening that happened there. And it was just so much easier for me to then talk about these issues and say things to my boss, like, we're supposed to be here to help youth recognize and reach their full potential. Well, they can't do it in the context of institutional racism. So if we want youth to recognize and reach their full potential, we need to address systemic racism. We don't just need to help them learn how to do better in a job interview. And that's something I had never really been able to articulate until that time, when we were seeing how, racism and other systemic oppressions were manifesting in society in such a visceral way.
I'm wondering how you see that interaction between sport as this like larger entity and institutional racism or systemic racism. What are some of the drawbacks or some of maybe the negatives that we've seen? And on the other side of that, what's that potential power where sport can really flip that on its head?
Wow. Yeah. Great question. So, I promise to keep it upbeat, but I don't know if I can on this.
No, this is, you give a freebie here. Yeah. Say however you feel.
Yeah. So, certainly professional sport is a capitalist activity. We know that capitalism is upheld by racism. That's a fact. Capitalism is upheld by white supremacy. So, to think that we can fully achieve an anti-racist society through professional sport is short-sighted, I would say. But I do see so many examples. Like when I look to one of our teams, actually, I would say all of our teams have done something over the past few years that has truly inspired me to believe in professional sport and corporate sport as a power for good. So I'm thinking of things like the work that the Toronto Raptors have done, really embedding social justice into their work through a social impact and culture team that's out in the community doing all kinds of things, speaking out about political issues like gun violence, and making it political as well. That's been important. When I go to a game, and things like the land acknowledgement at the game can seem superficial, but at the same time, it's creating a more welcoming and inclusive space than we would have experienced 5 years ago at a professional football game. So, I think there's room. I think athlete activism is really important there, because these are the heroes. These are who people look to, whether it's kids or adults. These are the people who people look to glean values from, to role model, to identify with. So, we see a lot of positive examples of athlete activism right now. And in a lot of cases, we see leagues being more supportive of athlete activism than we might have expected or that we might have seen, 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. So that to me is a lot of movement in the right direction. And I think the discourse is always valuable. And even when horrible things are happening in sport, like I'm thinking of the racist taunts that Nazem Kadri experienced during NHL playoffs this past year. The discourse around it was really challenging, and what's happening. So the fact that it wasn't just, of course, you yell racist things at people who are not white, who are playing hockey. Where I think, 10 years ago, those comments, there wouldn't have been an outcry over those types of comments. It's horrific that they're still happening, but the fact that there is a powerful discourse happening around them is a step in the right direction. What's next? Teams need to be taking up that mantle. Teams need to be calling out those kinds of actions, backing up their anti-racist statements and their land acknowledgement by actually standing up for Black and Brown and Indigenous athletes who are experiencing racism in a sport context. But I have hope that we are moving in that direction. And I know that there are people within those organizations, because I'm privileged to work with many of them, who do want things to move in that direction and are pushing and are fighting that fight every day.
Thanks so much, Marika, for sharing your perspective and insights on how race and anti-racism has a role to play in sport for development, as well as, of course, the wider sporting sector. It's so important for everyone to be thinking about these things and pushing for progress, equity, and inclusion. Quick break here to highlight what I consider to be a fabulous resource that I've created for any listeners out there interested in learning more about the sport for development and peace sector. You've come to the right place. In addition to Inspira Podcast episodes that you can listen to, I've created a written resource that you can read, which currently has over 90 items I've curated from my own experience and vetted with other experts in the field. These include databases to find award-winning organizations, links to reports, books, and research, as well as recommended newsletters and recorded webinars, all Sport for Dev related. I encourage you to have a look. You can find this resource by visiting my LinkTree, listed in each episode's show notes. Then clicking Erika's Global Resource Hub. That's right, Erika's Global Resource Hub. If you like what you read and what you hear, I'd love it if you could give Inspira a 5-star review on your chosen podcast platform and write a kind review. That would be so energizing for me, and it would help Inspira reach more ears. Thanks, and back to the show.
3, 2, 1, yeah!
Now, turning more to research and monitoring and evaluation in your work at MLSE, I'd love to hear how you or your team gathers feedback from participants and perhaps more about the tracking tool you all developed called Scoreboard.
In the Launchpad community, which is the Moss Park neighborhood of downtown Toronto, is where we're located, but we do serve youth from all across the greater Toronto area. We're constantly in a feedback loop with that group. So we use a lot of digital engagement through a software product that we developed internally with MLSE's digital labs team. It's called MLSE Scoreboard, and it's a really powerful tool that we originally built sort of just because SurveyMonkey is not youth friendly, and we needed something that was. And at first, we just thought we were building a youth-friendly, fun SurveyMonkey, but it turned into so much more. It turned into this whole sport for development software platform where we can house curriculum, we can send out challenges, youth can earn badges, we can have the registration and attendance captured through there. We collect all that great race-based data through there and other demographic data as well. So that's another way that we're constantly getting feedback from our youth and parents and guardians in the local community. And, during COVID, that was a huge thing as well. We started doing a monthly needs assessment at that time, just to ask youth, where were they at? Were they getting physical activity? And some months, let me tell you, it was grim. It was most youth were getting, like 10 minutes a week type of level of physical activity. Were they getting enough to eat? Had their family's income decreased as a result of the pandemic? These types of questions. And we were able to track that month by month over the pandemic. So that was a really great data touch point. Now that youth and families are back in the space, we continue to use digital engagement, but then there's also that, anecdotal and word of mouth feedback on what's happening in the community, which is extremely valuable as well.
Mm-hmm. That scoreboard sounds like a great asset to you and your colleagues, just in terms of storing things and as you mentioned, being able to engage digitally with participants. So not every sport for development organization can house something like that or create something like that. I'm wondering how you've seen maybe less resourced organizations still create and employ a robust M&E system of some sort. Are there any examples or maybe monitoring tools that you can create for free?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll point out a couple of good resources. So their Youth Rex is a great website. So this is the Youth Research and Evaluation Exchange. So they have a few, it's not specific to sport, but it's all about good evaluation in the youth service space. So that does include sport for development. They do have some good sport specific resources on their website. And then just a ton of really great outcome measures that can be used in a lot of different youth sports settings, a lot of good primers on how to do M&E. They offer a lot of free online courses on things like how to do data analysis in Excel that are really accessible and beginner friendly. So I highly recommend them. Our own sport for development metrics framework is something that I would also highly recommend. So it's sort of the only thing of its kind that's really built for our sector. So that offers a range of 18 different standardized tools that can be used to measure youth outcomes, youth program quality, things like that, youth engagement in sport for development settings. So these are all evidence-based tools that we've developed and tested with thousands of youth in our own space that are in various stages of validation as well. So that can be accessed on our website. So those are a couple tools I would recommend. And, Layup Youth Basketball is the first organization I think of when I think of a more grassroots organization that's doing some very good M&E. And what would I point to as good practices that they've done? They've reached out to people with expertise. So they talk to us all the time. They ask us questions because they know that we have an embedded research team. So, that's one thing. Don't be afraid to ask. People are often happy to share. It's part of my goal and objective and mandate to share that knowledge externally as well. It's not anything we're trying to hold close to our chest by any stretch. So that, and then they're just finding ways that it works in their programming. So thinking about what's the best way for us to collect data. Is it by sending out a survey by email? Is it your youth ride on a school bus to get to programming? Is that the time where you sort of have a captive audience and you can collect data, pass around an iPad? Just thinking about what's going to work for your youth. Even things like, whether it's in programming, after programming, at the meal, after programming, just really thinking about how is the most practical way to integrate it. And often that means, talking to your coaches to figure that out, right? Like it's never going to be the best solution if it's someone in senior management just kind of coming up with ideas that aren't based on how programming is actually delivered and how it looks on the ground.
Marika, I'm wondering if you can give an example of how you or your team have used data to inform a programmatic change.
Oh yeah. Okay. So I have an example from today. So just to have a lengthy debrief with academic partner this morning. So we collaborated with a couple of researchers, Doctors Chen and Kerwin and Mike Narain, two fantastic researchers at Brock University. And in the sport management department. So we worked with them on a study looking at some of our girls programming. So we know drop off for girls around the 11 to 14 age group has always been a big issue. We started seeing even more of that during the pandemic and started to worry that girls were not going to want to come back. Our 2021 Change the Game research study, about a third of the girls were less interested in sports at that time than they had been pre-pandemic. So we were concerned about this. So we launched this study looking at our Monday night girls programming. Monday night is when we offer girls only programming. So looking at that programming, was it engaging? Did it support retention in sport for development for girls? So they worked with us over the past year to embed this research into the programming and carry it out. It was a really fantastic experience, and then based on the debrief of that, and I guess it's a bit early to say that we have implemented it, but we just this morning created the plan how we're going to implement that data and those learnings into programming. So they came back to us. They said, yes, the programming is effectively engaging girls, but here are some of the issues. The older girls want more choice. They want to come to programming and be able to say, here's what we want to do. They also want not to learn the life skills that you've decided are important for them. They want to be the ones who are determining what life skills are important for them. Yeah. And they want a sort of access to more high-level coaches that would be like maybe more closely mimic what an elite sport environment would look like. So these were some really interesting learnings for us. And the next step is that we're going to have a knowledge mobilization session. So this meeting this morning was just with my one other member of my team and me, so both researchers plus the university-based researchers. So next step, the university researchers, the sport for development research team, and some of our sport programming team will sit down, we'll look at those learnings together and talk about what can we actually change in programming? How can we perhaps bring more members of women's university teams into the space on Monday nights during those programs to inspire and continue to engage those girls to keep coming out on Monday nights to get the positive outcomes that we know that they can get? How can we build curriculum where the youth are determining the life skills? What does that look like? How can we create evidence-based programming on the fly, essentially? So it's going to be interesting, but that's one where we're in the process right now of integrating some data to improve the program and program outcomes.
That's so interesting to hear about and learn about. And I'm wondering more about the timelines that you're working with, because you mentioned the advantages of having that living lab and you and your team being able to move quite quickly when maybe other bodies of research might come out and the findings might not be relevant anymore, depending on the population. And you're shaking your head, so I must be somewhat accurate here. Talk to me maybe about those two different sides of the coin, right? Where it sounds like you can move swiftly, and maybe the unfortunate other reality where research could take so much time that it may not be relevant anymore.
And sometimes it's not even the speed of the research. Like sometimes the research can get done within a reasonable time frame, but by the time so the paper is published, that could be another 3 years after the research is done. And then for people to actually read the paper, that might take another 3 years just for the right people to find it at the right time. And then they implement it. And then they start talking about like, oh, this evidence-based tactic actually worked. And then others start picking it up. So, I read a stat somewhere. I think it takes on average, and I'm not sure how they did this research, but it was like 10 to 16 years for evidence to actually make its way into practice once the
That's
research
so
is done.
scary.
It's terrifying. It's absolutely unreal. Yes, because how effective are those tactics or strategies going to be in this very rapidly changing world at that time? So, we're always striking a balance between, we see the value of publishing in academic journals, and it's something that we do regularly. But I think to some degree, it also depends on the topic. Like there's some things where it's just more important to self-publish, to get those learnings out there faster to the people that need to see it, and to academics as well, so that they can integrate those learnings into their research plans as well. And so when we partner with academics, we talk to them about what knowledge mobilization and knowledge translation outputs are going to be most valuable. And there's a lot of pressure on them to translate and mobilize knowledge in certain ways as well. So it's always a bit of a dance, but we do really think that both are important. That rapid self-publication model, and then that academic publication model where, that's where people go often when they want references. So we do want to be in that space when someone looks up anti-racism in sport in an academic database. We want our stuff to pop up because we believe it's high quality. But at the same time, we need that information to get out there sooner because youth need anti-racist sport approaches today, right? So, yeah.
Wow. It's just one of the many complexities of monitoring evaluation. Marika, I'm wondering if you can talk to me more about how innovative engagement plus data collection has looked, especially in this returning to in-person programming. Do you have any exciting examples that you can share?
Okay, yeah. I know you asked for post-pandemic. The first example that came to mind was a pre-pandemic one, so I'm going to put it out there.
Please.
So MLSD, a few years ago, we acquired an esport team for the first time. So all of a sudden, esport was becoming a really hot thing. Now we have an esport NBA 2K team. We engage with all of our pro teams, right? The Raptors, Leafs, Argos, Toronto FC. So naturally, we would engage with the 2K team as well. So, but then this was super contentious among our staff team, where, obviously in sport for development, there'd be a wide range of positions on does esport constitute a sport and how it should be utilized in a sport for development context. So, sort of back to that living lab experimental approach that we talked about earlier, we decided to do an experiment. Like, let's do a program that's based on esport, but that also engages youth in physical activity on court. Let's see what the outcomes are. If it doesn't work at all, great. We'll put it to bed. We don't have to do that again. If it works, maybe it's an area to explore. So we took some, we had some youth register in a program that was a March break camp. It was a 1-week camp where they would spend the morning sort of in a classroom where they were doing esport activities, learning different plays on the console, and then they would come out and do some activities on court. They would go through a warm-up, do some plays on court, and kind of replicate the same plays that they had done virtually on the court. They also learned some nutrition information and got to meet some of the members of the 2K team and work with them throughout the week. So we measured some life skills around teamwork, communication, and leadership. And we did find some really positive outcomes coming out of that program that seemed really promising. So that's not a tactic that we've engaged in again, but now coming back to post-pandemic, it's something that post-pandemic we're really looking to build on. And we know as well through collecting data that more and more girls have started to engage with video games and esport over the pandemic as a result of, being stuck in their homes. So we're thinking that this may be another avenue to engage girls as well as re-engaging sort of older youth who may see that as a hook to engagement. So So that is definitely something that we're exploring that I would consider to be pretty innovative. Don't consider myself a gamer, didn't allow my kids screen time until he was 5, but if it's effective, it's effective. And that's something I'd like to continue to explore.
That's so interesting, and I've actually been a little bit surprised that Sport for Development hasn't embraced esports as much, because when you think about inclusion or people with disabilities or gender representation, like assuming or hoping that there's access to some technology or a space, you can engage a lot of different people. And so of course there's the argument of it being stagnant, and you could talk to my parents all day about that. I didn't play video games either, but there still perhaps is this opportunity to engage esports and technology. So I think that's a bit untapped in Sport for Dev right now.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm looking forward to seeing what we can do in that space.
Are there any success stories or even fun stories that you can share from the experience you've had at Launchpad working in Sport for Development so far?
Yeah, so I mean, one that always seems to touch my heart is okay. All my funny stories seem to relate back to Scoreboard, so I'll give you two. The one was so through Scoreboard, when youth fill out their surveys and do other, they can do like a push-up challenge at home or a green vegetable challenge or all these other little fun challenges that build on life skills or sort of reinforce things that we're trying to teach them in programming. So youth earn points, and then with their points, they can trade those in for Raptors gear, Leafs gear, all kinds of sport equipment and apparel. So we had a youth who was saving up their points all year. We were wondering, like, this kid's like at the top of the leaderboard with their points. What are they doing? Like, why? Every other kid is like, oh, I have 10 points. Let me get a fidget spinner. They just want to spend, right? So, so then this kid, December comes, they use all their points to get Christmas gifts for their entire family from the Scoreboard store. Very lovingly picking out like the little Raptors stuffy for their little sister and the like hoodie for their mom, and it was just the sweetest thing in the world. And just the level of pride that child had to be able to give that to their family that they had earned by participating in Sport for Development. Amazing. And then the other one is more kind of right at times. So they had figured out a way to hack into the Scoreboard system and give points to themselves and their friends. So on one hand, we were like, not good behavior, but on the other hand, you kind of had to give them props for it.
Yeah, that's impressive. They cracked the system.
Yeah. So that was another fun moment.
Oh, wow. That holiday story. That is heartwarming. Oh, how sweet. I know you have also mentioned kind of two main components in your career journey so far that we haven't dug deep quite yet. I'm wondering if you wanted to share anything on either of these two. And so the first is any career challenges that you've faced and how you've coped with them. And the second is the importance for you to stay curious and engaged.
Yeah. So I'd say, typical career challenges of being in the sport industry, which is a demanding industry that expects a lot of you. So the first was, and this is, getting a little bit personal, a couple months after I landed my dream job, which is my current job, I had an unexpected pregnancy. I had my son, and it was really hard to tell those around me that I was, because I didn't want it to seem that I wasn't committed and excited about and engaged with and, wanting to really give everything to my job, because I really, really did. So getting my head around that I could become a mom and still really engage with my new job and with my career path at the level that I wanted to, took a lot of time for me. But there's a lot of examples around me, including my boss, who, when I finally told her, I put off telling her until I was like 5 months pregnant. And when I finally told her, was incredibly supportive. And, she's a great example of someone who has kids and has continued to really build her career while being an awesome mom as well. So I was looking to those examples and really, staying in touch with work during my mat leave and, just trying to come back as strong as I could. But that was extremely challenging, I would say. And then the second is, I actually moved to Winnipeg during the pandemic. So I'm actually in Winnipeg right now. My job is, of course, based in Toronto. So, this was something that my family and I decided that we wanted to do during the pandemic. Our life in Toronto had just become pretty unsustainable. And, we were living in downtown Toronto in a really small loft. And it was not a great situation. So we felt that we could have a better lifestyle in Winnipeg, which is my hometown. So I told my boss I was moving to Winnipeg, and trying to have this is my giving notice conversation. But then this is the same boss who, saw me through my pregnancy as well. She was supportive. She said, Marika, why are you quitting? I don't care. Move to Winnipeg and do your job. And that's what I've done. I'm back in Toronto at least every 2 months. And, so far, so good, touch wood. I've been able to continue to stay in good touch with my team. I honestly feel closer to my colleagues than I ever have before. I do sometimes feel out of touch when I'm missing events or missing things that are happening at the facility. But that's another major challenge that I feel I have overcome by, using a lot of tools and just really committing to relationships and to building connection with my colleagues virtually.
Thank you for sharing that with me and with us, and just for being vulnerable about the challenges of being human and just where life takes you and family takes you. And I'm so happy for your sake and the foundation's sake that you were able to stay on board, because that's just what it should be, right? And not always what we have the opportunity to do. So I'm really happy in that regard. And what about staying curious and staying engaged? What role has that played in your career and your career success?
Yeah, I mean, I think just as a researcher, it's so essential. And I'm really blessed in the setting that I'm in to have a lot of autonomy. So if I have a research idea, I really do have the freedom to execute it as long as it fits into our theory of change, fits into our overall business strategy for the year. So that's fantastic. I'm trying to think about what areas I'm really exploring right now. So I'd say anti-racism in sport, that's a real prominent area of exploration for me right now. How do we use sport to support employment training and positive employment outcomes is something I've done a lot of exploration around. That was the paper we initially started chatting around. And then, sport and social change more broadly, and how can sport be utilized to achieve positive social change, including relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. And that's an area I'm really excited to get into a little bit more. And I'm doing some work around right now. So sort of like more radical or really progressive or sort of deep approaches to inclusion and youth sport. And what can that mean? Like going beyond the sort of more, I guess, traditional ideas of what inclusion looks like in youth sport, to think about it from a really radical way. Like, what if we really turn youth sport on its head? Like, what if it doesn't at all have to look like the way that we've always done it? What could that look like? So that's something I'm excited to be exploring.
Do you have any teasers to what that looks like? I'm like so intrigued.
Yeah, so that's a project I have ongoing right now. I'd say we're like about 1/3 of the way into that project. So, check back around December.
Now that we know more about our guest's career journey, the rest of our conversation will allow us to have some fun and get to know our guest on a personal level through some rapid fire questions. We'll then start to wrap up with pointed questions focused on advice and how our listeners can transform interest into action. Enjoy the rest of the conversation. What makes a great dancer?
Listening to the music.
Ooh. Best Canadian sports team?
Toronto Raptors.
Do you have a favorite food?
Roti.
Favorite music?
New Orleans brass band music.
Ooh. Do you get much of that where you are in Winnipeg?
No. Although my husband's a musician, so he brings it into the space. Yeah.
Ooh, very cool. Very, very good decision on your part. Marika, do you have a best sports memory?
I'd say, watching what Ms. Biles went through at the last Olympics and just seeing the poise and grace that she handled that with, that was probably my favorite moment in sports.
Do you have a guilty pleasure?
Well, I'm watching Succession right now. It's pretty toxic. But I love it.
When's the last time you learned something new?
Well, I'm learning French right now. So I had I put my kid in French immersion, barely speaking French. So I'm working on it.
How would you describe your child?
Oh, he is sensitive, inquisitive, hilarious, athletic, adorable, just the best, the best.
Marika, what gives you energy?
the natural world, trees,
Mm,
rivers and oceans and sunshine and flowers and
mm,
creatures of the wild.
love it. What advice would you have given your younger self?
It's all leading somewhere. You don't need to get there today. Just build that career capital, put it all in your backpack. And when you get to your destination and you need to bring it out, you're going to have it. Okay. Just keep forging ahead.
Ooh, I like that backpack metaphor. I want to use that. Yeah, what else would you put in the backpack for others? So giving them advice if folks are interested in working in sport for development and peace. What advice might you tell them?
So I would say have an understanding of how do you utilize data, even if you're not a data person, be able to utilize data. Like anyone in should be able to look at some findings and know how to make some sense out of it and be able to extrapolate something practical out of that. So I would say read research when you get the opportunity to help you develop that skill. If you're so inclined, like learn a data software. It's such a valuable skill. And even if it's not something you use in your day to day, like I don't use a lot of data, I don't do a lot of data analysis at this time, but having that understanding I find to be really valuable. And then, yeah, also be on the ground. Like I find the fact that I was a dance instructor and a dancer so valuable to me working in sport for development, and put that on your resume. I think a lot of people don't put, oh, that they used to be a community coach or whatever on their resume now that they're in a more quote professional context because they don't think that it's relevant, but it is. So really lead on that background, your sport background, and make sure you get that experience.
And what types of skills or traits do you look for when you're bringing someone onto your team, or simply that you would encourage folks to try to develop those skills if they're interested in working in sport for development?
I'd say just being able to work with a wide range of people. So in sport for development, you're going to be dealing with all kinds of stakeholders from extremely grassroots, community level to pro sport and really corporate entities. You're likely reporting to a board of directors. I happen to report to 3 boards of directors. So that's a really important skill. Just being able to adjust yourself to the room and being able to talk in a range of different rooms while still being yourself and bringing
Yeah.
out your best qualities. So just get comfortable being in a lot of spaces, be okay being the only you in the room. And yeah, just expose yourself to a lot of different types of people.
Good advice. Good advice. Are there any sport for dev organizations that you would recommend folks try to learn about, whether it's in Canada or globally?
Oh gosh. Yeah. So I mentioned Layup Youth Basketball. I think they're a fantastic example of a grassroots org that's doing amazing stuff. Hockey Diversity Alliance, really awesome group in the hockey world that was founded by a bunch of racialized hockey players who were looking to address some of the issues that they went through coming up. And now they're offering sport for development, programming as well, starting this fall, which is awesome. So check them out. And then on the hockey side as well, Hockey for Youth, they're based in Montreal. They're doing incredible work in the youth hockey space. So yeah, those are 3 I would list.
What about sport for development resources?
Yeah, so Journal of Sport for Development is a solid subscribe. If you sign up for their updates, I guarantee they send you a notification every time they publish a new article. I'd say 50% of the articles that I get a notification on are really interesting and highly relevant to my work. So
Nice.
that's pretty good odds, I would say,
Yeah.
for a newsletter. So that's one I would 100% recommend. And then I'm trying to think, Sport and Dev is another good one to have on your radar for sure, just because they have post a lot of content from a lot of different places. So that's a good sort of starting off point to learn about the entire ecosystem and have access to a lot of different organizations in the space.
And finally, any advice regarding strategic networking?
Mm. Yes, I mean, I would say networking is about building relationships. So it must not be transactional. You have to enter it just looking to create a connection, a genuine human connection with the other person. It can't be about what can they do for me, right? So that seems kind of obvious, and yet I feel like that's still a lot of the random people I get reaching out to me on LinkedIn. It seems very one-sided. They don't seem to be interested in creating a connection between us. So that would be my advice. Like, make it about the relationship first. If it's someone you really want to get to know and genuinely would like to have a relationship and a connection with, continue building it.
For anyone listening, please rewind and listen to that again, because that is spot on. Strategic networking, just networking in general. It's about relationships. So I really appreciate your response there. Marika, how can the audience support you or your work moving forward?
Oh, goodness. So we are always looking for partners and collaborators. If you're a researcher, a grad student, a community-based researcher looking to collaborate, please reach out, find us through our website, access our papers, reference our papers, utilize our tools. We have a whole suite of measurement tools available through our Sport for Development metrics framework that we'd love to see more organizations using in their programming. We also have our MLC scoreboard digital platform, which we are currently, looking to make available to other sport for development organizations in the not-for-profit space to use with their youth to help facilitate collection of more and better data. So, I'd say use our tools, reach out to learn more.
And I'll be sure to put those resources in the show notes because they're excellent. And my final question, Marika, who inspires you?
I'm fortunate to have a lot of really powerful people within my own organization who I can look up to. So I'm going to point to my boss, Tanya Marek, who's the Vice President of Community Engagement and Social Impact at Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment. Just a maverick, a really confident woman who just goes after what she believes in. And she has inspired me to really adopt a more out there kind of attitude and presentation of myself, I would say, and not feel like I need to always be small and girly, which I think is something that comes from being a ballet dancer, right? And that I brought to my professional life for a long time. It's like, no, you know what? I may be feminine, but I can be loud and I can take up space, and that's cool. So definitely I would point to her. There's a few other women at the executive leadership level within MLSC who are definitely great examples as well. Terry Dennis Davies, Shannon Hosford, Melissa Bob Clark. There are just too many to list.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of the Inspira Podcast with Erika Mueller-Chen. I really hope you enjoyed the episode and found it useful. Be sure to check out the show notes for links and resources. Specifically, my LinkTree is there with tons of awesome information. Feel inspired to take action today? I've got 3 action steps you can take right now because you know your girl likes calls to action and the number 3. So here goes. Number 1, follow the podcast on your chosen podcast platform. Number 2, share your feedback with me through the listener survey listed on that LinkTree. And number 3, tell just one friend about this podcast so they can give it a listen too. And do I have any overachievers out there? I've got a bonus action step, which is to consider supporting me and making sure this passion project prospers. So, number 4, follow the link to buy me a coffee. That would be pretty amazing. Until next time, stay inspired.